You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. Where today we're doing a little bit of opinion scholarship, as we like to do. Today we're going to do it on Pythagoras. So I got a little book. It was a recommendation from Neil at the Gnostic Informant to dig into Pythagoras, which is like the OG pre-Socratic, the guy at the very, very beginning of the Greek philosophical tradition. And the episode was kind of interesting. Let me just pop this up for you. So this is just going to be a way for me to visualize the difference. We're going to be talking about Pythagoras on one end, fellow you're seeing on the left. We're going to be talking about Moses on the other. Needs no introduction. You see Moses on the right. So what I'm going to be doing today, it's kind of sparked from a conversation that Neil over at Gnostic Informant was having. So it was really about the code of law that people live under, that we allow to govern our behavior and interactions and all of this, our moral codes, our ethical codes, all of that. And we're all very familiar in the West with the Mosaic law, and we all sort of internalize it, and it becomes a part of us. And so we don't often think about alternatives, some other code. More importantly, we don't think about those moral codes that we followed or our ancestors followed before we were Christian, before we had a Mosaic law to follow. And it's kind of a shame, right? There's kind of a hole there that I think many people, when confronted by that, want to explore, they want to fill. So I guess where I want to begin is just to say that in the West, we're so steeped in the Judeo-Christian tradition and are so disconnected from our ancestral ways that we never ask what law stood as our judge before we adopted the laws of Moses along with Christianity. I think it's especially true in the United States, where the descendants of Europe lived their whole lives never seeing so much as an echo of their ancestral history, never hearing their mother tongue spoken, never witnessing the grandeur of Stonehenge or Karnak or Gossick. Our contemporary worldview assumes the moral finality of the Ten Commandments, making any other code superfluous. And this topic came up recently, like I said, on Neil's show, The Gnostic Informant, and they were having this conversation that was, to me, stunning. And you might ask why, and the answer is maybe embarrassing, but the truth is I never considered it before. For me, as a Christian, divine law is articulated in the Bible. I'm sure I knew about other famous law codes. I mean, the Code of Hammurabi, right? That was given. If you ever see the Stele of Hammurabi, you can see God handing the laws down to the king, exactly like you see in the Moses story, and it predates the Moses story. So we have the Code of Hammurabi, we have the Athenian Code of Solon, we have the Justinian Code from Byzantine Rome. I never thought to compare them. I never wondered if one might be better than another, if the ideal represented in these codes might be more compatible with my personal values and moral aspirations. Stated differently, I wondered for the first time if the laws of Moses fall short of the ideal articulated outside of the Bible, right? I don't know what these codes are and what they say outside of the Bible. If another code might actually accord better with my own intuitions. And now I wonder what adopting another code would mean. Would it change my goals, my judgments, my sensibilities? Would it make me a different person? And this question has more weight now, perhaps in this era where traditional European culture is once again finding purchase in the minds of Westerners who are seeking to rediscover their identity. And I see this phenomenon as akin to the movement of some Black Americans towards Islam beginning in the 1960s. as a way of rejecting a Western Christian identity that was thrust upon their ancestors. I see the same kind of accumulated resentment from Westerners all over the internet who are asking questions like, who was Thor and Odin, and why did we reject them, and how did the pagans worship, and these sorts of things. And these inquiries are, of course, only heightened by the deep curiosity sparked whenever something is forbidden. European pagan heritage has been so thoroughly erased from the cultural consciousness and its associated worldview that it has indeed become forbidden. Like, we're Christians after all, and paganism is of the devil, right? Right? Now, because this is an open question, I'd like to compare the Law of Moses to one of Europe's oldest surviving moral codes, the so-called golden verses of Pythagoras. They got that name from a Neoplatonic philosopher much later, a guy named Heracles of Alexandria in the 5th century AD. But the verses themselves, they go back to an original composition by Pythagoras, which was a millennia earlier. This is deep antiquity, standing at the very beginning of the Greek philosophical tradition. And I'd like to examine this in contrast to the Torah and see how they differ, what they emphasize, and most importantly, what the spirit of the law is in both cases. I want to know if I align better with the law that I inherited from a cultural tradition not of my own, or if perhaps I'm missing something to be found in the law codes, which did spring from the minds of my cultural ancestors. Okay, let's first examine how the pre-classical Greeks guided their people towards the good life, or the virtuous life, as they would have put it. We're going to begin with the golden verses of Pythagoras, likely written sometime in the 500s BC, something like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole thing for you. I'm not going to stop and give you my commentary, at least on the first pass. I want to read it to you. Then we'll read through the 10 Commandments, and then we'll do the compare and contrast. So I just want you to soak this in, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read to you something that will sound like the 10 Commandments. It'll sound like rules to live by. It'll sound like wisdom literature. But this is coming from a very different place than the source of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it predates most of the Hebrew Bible. If you follow any of the controversy around the dating of the canon, the Old Testament canon, there's a lot of evidence that suggests while parts of it were written at an early period, like the Psalms famously are considered to be very ancient, maybe from 800s BC or something like that, the actual corpus, the actual canon of the Torah doesn't come together, or the Tanakh, I guess you might say, and the prophets and all that, until much, much closer to the time of Jesus, honestly. There's a very, very narrow gap, really, between the time the Gospels were written and the time the Old Testament was put together. There's not that much of a gulf of time here. So we're going to go way back to a time before there was a Hebrew Bible in the form we have it now. When, the Psalms and the Proverbs and things like that may have existed. But even the idea of Moses in 500 BC was not known largely. So I'm going to get off course if I go too far down that line, but just know there's controversy around the dating. So what I'm going to do here is give you what I believe to be an older code than what we're getting from the laws of Moses. So allow me to just kind of read through it. The golden verses of Pythagoras begin like this. First, honor the immortal gods as the law demands. Then reverence thy oath and the illustrious heroes. Then venerate the divinities under the earth. Then honor your parents and all of your kindred. Among others, make the most virtuous thy friend. Learn from his deeds that are useful. Alienate not the beloved comrade for trifling offenses. Bear all you can, for power is bound to necessity. Take this well to heart. You must gain control of your habits. First over your stomach, then sleep, and then luxury and anger. What brings you shame? Do not unto others, nor by yourself. The highest of duties is honor of self. Let justice be practiced in words as in deeds. Neither forget that death is appointed to all, that possessions here gladly gathered, here must be left. Whatever sorrow the fate of the gods may here send us, bear whatever may strike you with patience. Let no one with speech or with deeds ever deceive you to do or to say what is not the best. Think before you act, that nothing stupid results. Do nothing beyond what you know, yet learn what you may need. Thus shall your life grow happy. Do not neglect the health of the body. Follow clean habits of life. Avoid all things which will arouse envy. Never show yourself stingy. Ere thrice you review what this day you did. Wherein have I sinned? What did I? What duty is neglected? All from first to last review. And if you have erred, grieve in your spirit. Rejoice for all that was good. This then repeat, and learn to repeat it with joy. Thus wilt thou tread on the paths of heavenly virtue. Never start on your task until you have implored the blessings of the gods. If this you hold fast, soon you will recognize of gods and mortal men the true nature of existence, how everything passes and returns. Then you will see what is true, how nature is all, how nature in all is most equal. Father Zeus, O free them from suffering. Show unto each the genius who is their guide. Yet do not fear, for the mortals are divine by race, to whom holy nature everything will reveal and demonstrate. Consider all things well. Let reason, the gift divine, be thy highest guide. Then you should be separated from the body. You will be imperishable, a divinity, a mortal no more. Whew, buddy. I don't know what you make of it, but powerful, right? And unique. Let me give you the contrast before we get into it. I'm going to give you mostly the 10 Commandments. This is from Exodus chapter 20. I'll sprinkle in, as we get into the contrast, some of the Psalms and the Proverbs and those sorts of things. But what I'm going to read you now is from Exodus 20, and it'll be familiar. God says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make any graven image. Thou shalt not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, nor thy servant, nor thy cattle. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thy neighbor's wife, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." All right, there they are, the 10 Commandments. A briefer section for sure. I probably could have added some things that I cut out for brevity, but you get the picture. And having let those soak in, having all the kind of cognitive dissonance and those ideas popping in your head about how they vary, I'm going to give you my analysis. I'm going to show you what I make of it. So let's get in this section. I'm going to call analysis and comparison. So when Pythagoras opens what does he say? He says, first, right? This is the first and most important thing. First, honor the immortal gods. Okay, now there's parallels. We heard things much like this from the Ten Commandments. Things like have no other gods before me. Also, by the way, the first commandment. So whether we're talking about the 10 commandments or the golden verses, the first and most important commandment is to honor the gods or honor God. The Bible's specific about it. The Bible says not to take the Lord's name in vain, to keep the Sabbath. These are ways of honoring God. So in both cases, the most important principle is piety. It's recognition and honor of the creator, our creator, of God, of the divine, in whatever form you understand it. Next, the golden verses say, reverence thy oath. I think it's interesting that honor the gods is first, and then it says, then reverence thy oath, as though this is the order of operations. Like honor the gods is the most important. The second most important is your oath, your word. Okay, and I think that's unique in the Greek code, this idea of one's word and reputation being of paramount importance, of religious importance, actually. And then it goes on, it says the next thing right on the list after honor the gods and honor thy oath is honor the illustrious heroes. Okay, now this I find to be also unique and worth talking about a little bit because it pertains to revering culture heroes, like as though they're the subject of emulation or imitation. It's like we have this perfect ideal hero. He represents this pattern that we want people to aspire to. Okay, so to honor the heroes is interesting. It's not something we see in the Old Testament, right? It's asking us to become the embodiments of our culture's ideal, to become Hercules, right? That kind of thing. The Old Testament never instructs people to imitate prophets or kings or heroes, right? I mean, the sins of King David might be a reason to avoid that, but more importantly, the temptation towards ancestor worship, really, towards polytheism, and the Bible's very much against that. That's the emphasis. That's the major thrust of the entire Bible, you might say, at least the Old Testament. So we're not going to hold King David up on a pedestal, or some rabbi, or some prophet up on a pedestal, and teach our children to be like them. See, the Old Testament doesn't do that. You know, if you had a culture figure like Achilles or something, and he's supposed to be, you know, his mother is the princess and his father is Zeus. You can start to see how, you know, Achilles is a demigod. He's part human and part divine. And, you know, it's a very slippery slope if you have people like that in your genealogy, to avoid worshiping them when you believe that they are part God, that kind of thing. So you can understand why having a culture hero as an ideal might not be something that, you know, the Hebrews are going to like that idea, right? They're not supposed to make graven images. They're not supposed to, right? So it runs counter to that, but you see it in the golden verses, and I find that to be interesting. Now, I mean, we do have something like this. You guys might remember in the 90s, the What Would Jesus Do bracelets, the little rubber bracelets that are now so popular for every cause under the sun. But back in the 90s, there was just one rubber bracelet, and it was WWJD. The idea here is that Christians were supposed to have this reminder, especially young Christians. This was like a youth sort of movement, that you were supposed to look down at your bracelet, and you were supposed to think about the person of Jesus and the example of Jesus, and you were supposed to model yourself after that. So this is not an uncommon thing in Christianity, but it's not something that existed in Judaism. It's not from a Hebrew tradition. And I'll remind you, of course, that the Gospels were written in Greek. At the time, you know, the Middle East was Hellenized. It was heavily influenced by Greek culture. And so in the first century, when Christianity arose and we start looking at Jesus as an ideal, as a subject to be imitated, this is something that was likely part of the Greek tradition and not the Hebrew one. I mean, we see that all over the place in classical Greek. Who were their heroes? Hercules, Achilles, Perseus, Jason, these people. And they were absolutely the subject of emulation and imitation. to become a hero. Like that was a possibility to the Greeks, to become a hero, to become semi-divine, immortal even. Next, the golden verses say, venerate the divinities under the earth. I found this to be very interesting. Because you remember, well, I'll just put it this way. The gods under the earth, okay, to venerate them is a different command than the one that we opened with, which was what? Honor the immortal gods, right? So there's a list, right? It's honor the immortal gods, honor your oaths, emulate the heroes. This is the order of operations. And then we get to venerate the divinities under the earth, right? This is fourth on the list, right? Honor the gods is the first one. And now we have this, oh, don't forget about those gods under the earth. This is strange, right? It's strange because the gods under the earth are not the Olympus dwellers. It's not Zeus the king and the shining, perfect Apollo. These are the chthonic gods, the gods of the earth and the underworld and of death. And this is significant because it recognizes within the realm of the divine aspects which are not transcendent, as the biblical God is, and even aspects which are seen as contaminating by the standards of the Old Testament. Things like dead bodies, substance, matter, things like magic, all of that. The Greek code demands that we come to terms with these things as part of the divine, as worthy of veneration, as part of reality's grand design. In the Old Testament, on the other hand, these ideas are rejected from the divine. They're ignored or pushed onto ideas like Satan, the adversary, or demons, in order to preserve a pristine God, untouched by these lower realities. The Old Testament God is considered perfect, specifically because it transcends these things. But to Pythagoras, perfection comes from completion, from wholeness, from the ability of the divine to be both good and evil, matter and spirit, Olympian and chthonic, simultaneously. Okay. This is the precursor to monotheism, the divine unity which the philosophers who came before Socrates called the monad. This is the idea of a monotheistic God. And people will argue with me about that. They'll argue with me about the language. The monad isn't a God. And I'll take up that argument. I'll make my case here. The monad is absolutely envisioned as envisioned as God, understood as the union of all things, right? The oneness. And they even call it, and the Neoplatonics even call God the one. So this is what we mean here. The one is everything. You cannot separate out evil from good, as an example. You have to come to terms with the divine as both. And this is a very different way of looking at God and our relationship to God than the one we see in the Hebrew Bible. All right, next he says, the golden verses say, then honor your parents and all of your kindred, right? So now we're on the fifth kind of tier here. Honor your parents and all of your kindred. And of course, we have a direct parallel in the Ten Commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother. Next, the golden verses say, make the most virtuous thy friend. Learn from his deeds that are useful. Obviously, this is quite different from anything we see in the Old Testament. Maybe not entirely unparalleled. In the Old Testament, we have, let's say in Proverbs 13, God says, quote, he that walketh with wise men shall be wise. And in Proverbs 1, a wise man will increase learning. Okay, so we have something like this, but the Greek commandment is slightly different. It specifically requires that we are selective about those we associate with, that we choose our friends exclusively based upon their personal virtue. Okay, but not only that, we choose them for their virtue in order to learn them, in order to acquire those virtues for ourselves. The Greek code implies that we have a divine responsibility, a duty to perfect ourselves, seeking out those qualities we lack from those who possess them. And this is very strange, I think. A lot of times I think we can all relate to this. We all have or had a good friend, somebody we had some deep connection with or have some deep connection with, somebody we consider a dear friend. We would be very sad if they died or if anything would happen to them, that kind of thing. And they're not always all good. I mean, certainly almost never the case. We tend to overlook the character flaws of our good friends, right? Because we appreciate them for other reasons. And so these small, weaknesses or lack of virtue, as the Greeks might put it, we just kind of brush that off because we're friends. Pythagoras says, no. Pick your friends specifically because they are better than you, and be friends with them specifically so that the things that they have that are better than you can learn from and adopt for yourself. So you can raise yourself to the level of your friends, right? So it's almost transactional. And this might seem to you, especially from a Christian perspective, like selfish, or like we're using our friends as tools or something like that. They're only useful if we can get something from them. But see, the Greeks had a different worldview. The Greeks were all about pursuing virtue. That was the meaning of life for the most part, the pursuit of virtue, to become virtuous. And so the idea that you can learn by example and absorb virtue through osmosis or something, like, it would be a great honor for somebody to befriend someone else for that reason. And you would think that if I befriended you just because of XYZ quality, well, that's actually something like a deep compliment, because it means that I believe you have something I don't, that I could have, that you have something to teach me that I could learn, and that I could become better as a consequence. So a very interesting thing, right, to have in the Pythagorean 10 Commandments, for lack of a better phrase. All right, next it says, alienate not the beloved comrade for trifling offenses. And this goes hand in hand with the one we just mentioned. It's like if I'm befriending somebody and learning from them and adopting their virtues and all of this, and they happen to like offend me in some small way, it doesn't behoove me to throw away that relationship. I have more to gain, from it still. So it makes sense on the surface, and we do have some parallels in the Old Testament. But I guess I'd point out that the Old Testament is filled with passages about God's mercy, about holding mercy up as a virtue. And this has a similar spirit to the Greek passage, the theme of preserving social unity through forgiveness. Now, Proverbs 19 says, quote, "It is a man's glory to overlook an offense." So you see that. There's a parallel there. I think maybe there's less interest, less appeal to me where there is direct parallels. So let's keep going. The next one, he says, "Bear all you can, for power is bound to necessity." Bear, okay, that word's, it's in my name, Christopher, right? Christos feren, to bear Christ, to carry it, right? This is saying carry all you can. Take all the responsibility you can onto your shoulders, because power is bound to necessity. Okay, I find this to be striking compared to the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament has a heavily legalistic interpretation of personal responsibility. I mean, Exodus, for instance, outlines appropriate recompense for all manner of crimes and injuries, which require, by divine law, the taking of responsibility and restoring lost value, an eye for an eye, and all of that. Responsibility is, again, about social cohesion. From the Greek perspective, however, responsibility is about power. It says so explicitly. Bear all you can. For power is bound to necessity. And this tells us to take on all the responsibility we could possibly manage. Okay, this reminds me of Jordan Peterson. He said this countless times. Because to do so will bring us strength and influence. It will make us more than we currently are. Responsibility for the Greeks was less about social cohesion and more about what I'm going to call self-building. And just as we saw with the command to imitate heroes and to learn and adapt the unique virtues of our friends, this command too centers on our divine responsibility to perfect ourselves to the extent we can. The golden verses go on to say, you must gain control of your habits, first over your stomach, then sleep, then luxury and anger. And there's something of a Spartan sensibility in this, very appropriately ancient Greek, right? A call to master your passions, so not to be ruled by them. And there are plenty of parallels of this in the Old Testament. I'm thinking about Proverbs 28, which says, he that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. But the goal is not identical. Where the Old Testament emphasizes self-control as a means to resist sin and temptation, the Greeks, again, present it as a self-conquering, as a means of becoming a greater being. The golden verses continue, what brings you shame, do not unto others, nor by yourself. And I don't know about you, but I'm reminded immediately of not the Old Testament, but the New Testament. I'm reminded of Jesus saying, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It sounds a bit like this. What brings you shame, don't do, right? Not to others or yourself. And of course, this is what do unto others really implies. But if we're going to stay in the Old Testament, maybe I'll point to Leviticus 19, which says, love your neighbor as yourself, which has the parallel meaning, right? Where I see a divergence between the Old Testament and Greek perspectives is the Greek insistence that we can determine a failure of virtue, right? A sin, for ourselves, intuitively, by our conscience rather than by consulting the Mosaic law. The feeling of shame is our judge rather than revealed law and social consequences as we would see in the Old Testament. And then Pythagoras says something I find to be very interesting. He says, the highest of duties is honor of self. So it's interesting to contrast this because he already gave us the first commandment, right, which is to honor the gods, the immortal gods. And now he says the highest of duties is to honor the self. And so there is a bit of a contrast here between self and God that comes up a lot in the pre-Socratics. It comes up a lot in mystical writings and that sort of thing. So according to the Old Testament, the highest of duties is not honor of self. Deuteronomy 6 says it's, quote, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. So we could point to the contrast between the Greek honor of self and the Hebrew honor of God as a question of priorities, but I'm not so sure. And we already saw Pythagoras' first and primary law is to honor the immortal gods, didn't we? And this brings to mind the notion of the monad again, like so common among the pre-Socratics, Pythagoras included. The idea is that all of reality, the physical and the spiritual, is all one unified entity. It's all one thing. It's all the monad. And under this model, the self is but an aspect of the monad. Like, how could it be otherwise? The monad is all that exists. So the self is an aspect of the monad, of God. The personal soul is but an aspect of the cosmic soul. And under this worldview, love of self and love of God are not distinct duties. They are the same. So different language, but we're getting to a similar place. All right, Pythagoras goes on to say, neither forget that death is appointed to all, that possessions here gladly gathered, here must be left. Right? You can't take it with you, as the old people like to say. And of course, the Old Testament echoes this, not in the Ten Commandments directly, but in the Psalms. So in Psalm 49, it says, for when he dies, he shall carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. So we have similar ideas, similar parallel ideas in the Old Testament. So this is a matter of value, right? This is a matter of, like there's a temptation in life to acquire material things, right? There's always a temptation, whether it be for luxury, whether it be for status, to win over the lady folk or to impress, your peers or whatever it is. There's always this temptation towards material possessions and wealth and hoarding and, peacocking and all of that stuff. And whether we're talking about Pythagoras or the Old Testament, we're reminded, it's like, hey, you can't take this with you. This is not important. So we have parallel values in that way. And we see that as we read through parallel values. But again, where I find the most interesting aspects are not where Pythagoras and Moses agree, but where they don't. So a few more here. Pythagoras says, let no one with speech or with deeds ever deceive you to do or to say what is not the best. Okay, so it's worded interestingly, isn't it? It's something like what the Ten Commandments say when they say, thou shalt not bear false witness, isn't it? It's something about not lying or being truthful. But listen to the Greek. The Greek is a little different. It says, don't ever with speech or with deeds deceive or allow yourself to be deceived, right? It goes beyond not lying. So there is a parallel here about not lying, about not intentionally deceiving. But where the Old Testament version limits responsibility to one's own actions, the Greek version emphasizes also allowing oneself to be deceived, like guarding against other people's actions. So to the Greeks, it was not just one's duty to be truthful, it was also one's duty to guard against their own gullibility and vulnerabilities. It reflects the ancient Greek maxim, gnothi seauton, know thyself. We must know our own weaknesses and vulnerabilities in order to protect against them, to know where personal growth is needed, right? Again, the theme of self-building comes to mind. Okay, next, the golden verses say, think before you act, that nothing stupid results, which I find to be fascinating because, look before you leap, on all these different aphorisms that we hear growing up. It just seemed to me to be, old-timey sayings. I just had no idea that how old-timey they are. Like, I had no idea that this sort of phrase, almost verbatim, goes all the way back to Pythagoras in 500 BC. Think before you act. Like, unbelievable. But of course, the Proverbs, again, are going to give us a parallel. I mean, it's not super explicit, but the Proverb 4, chapter 4 says, ponder the path of your feet, right? Which is something like look before you leap. It's something like think before you act. So again, parallel sentiments. The next one, though, not so much. The next one says, do not neglect the health of the body. We do not have the same emphasis here in the Old Testament. I think about the Spartans, the Spartan way of life. I think about the idea that the ancient Greek education was focused so much on physical education for the boys anyway. And then once they reach a certain age is when they transition from physical education to more of the academic stuff, reading and writing and arithmetic. So there's a primacy of importance placed on the health of the body. Now, the Old Testament has many passages about the importance of moderation, about avoiding drunkenness and gluttony, that kind of thing. It does not have the same emphasis on self-building as we've seen throughout the golden verses. Self-building involves mental, spiritual, and bodily perfection, or the attempt to reach that perfection. Okay, next, Pythagoras says, avoid all things which will arouse envy and never show yourself stingy. All right. Well, good advice, right? I think people that are generous and display generosity, they're some of the most, to me, some of the most powerful personalities, some of the most compelling personalities are people like that who are very generous. I got some personal stories and anecdotes I could say, but in the interest of time, avoid all things which will arouse envy does have some parallel in the Old Testament. The Ten Commandments, of course, say, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, wife, or anything that is thy neighbor's. And so this command not to covet is the same as not to be envious, right? But the Greek command is a little different, isn't it? Right? The Old Testament version focuses on modulating our emotional reactions to envy, right? It's about how we respond when we find ourselves feeling that, right? It's just like any emotion. It falls on us. It's not something that we can flip on and off with a switch. It happens to us. And when that spirit, rises up in us, how we respond to that, what we actually do, that's what the Old Testament is concerned about. It's like you find yourself being, covetous, knock it off. But the Greek version goes further, suggesting that we should know ourselves well enough to anticipate what will cause us to feel envy and actively avoid those things. It's not about modulating our reactions. It's about avoiding having those reactions, right? We have a duty not to sin, but also to avoid the temptation altogether. And this idea is paralleled better, I think, in the New Testament, when Jesus says, if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, right? Actually, I can't help but be reminded of a completely unrelated law code, one that's contained in the Tao Te Ching. This is an ancient Taoist holy book from China. And in one of its passages, it says, shut out from sight the things of desire, so that people's hearts shall not be disturbed. Right? It's not about don't be envious. It's about take precautions so that you can avoid disturbing people's hearts. You see, it's something closer to that the Greeks are doing. And this brings me to what might be the most unexpected, and for that reason, maybe my favorite bit, where Pythagoras recommends an exercise, not a physical one, a sort of a mental one. He says, ere thrice you review what this day you did. Okay, he's saying, I want you to, at the end of the day, I want you to go over everything you did that day 3 times. Make sure you don't miss anything. You go through it 3 fucking times. Not 1, not 2, 3 times. You note, where did you sin? What did you do? What duty did you neglect? And it says, all from first to last review. And if you've erred, grieve in your spirit, right? If you did something wrong, feel it. Let yourself sit there and simmer on your failure, what you did wrong and why. And it says, rejoice for all that was good, right? Do the same thing for all the things you're proud of, for all of the accomplishments. Think about them. How did you do them? Reinforce it, right? It says, this then repeat and learn to repeat it with joy, right? Do it every day, over and over. Make it a practice, make it part of you. It says, thus wilt thou tread on the paths of heavenly virtue. Now, again, this is the most compelling command towards self-building, isn't it? A command for daily self-reflection, to admit to and confront your failings and triumphs so that you can continue to work on your flaws and repeat your success, so that your self-consciousness continues to grow. And while there aren't any direct comparisons to this practice outlined in the Old Testament, the closest I can do is again from the Proverbs, which say, search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there be any wicked way in me. Now, the difference here comes down to who is doing the reflecting, right? The Greeks placed that responsibility on the individual. The Old Testament puts it onto God. God is the judge of man. Man is not judge of himself from the perspective of the Old Testament. And this brings me to my conclusion. First, for the low-hanging fruit, we'll get them out of the way. We can clearly see some parallels in the guidance given in the laws of Moses and Pythagoras. Many, even more or less verbatim. I would expect as much, given that we're all human beings facing similar challenges and battling similar demons. We all share some similar biology, right? Instincts, psychology. So, of course, we see similar advice with a certain universal applicability. I'm thinking of things like the command to honor your parents, to be pious or humble, and to remember that acquiring material possessions is conclusively not among the most important things in life. As you might have noticed, many of these parallels do not come directly from the Ten Commandments, but rather from the so-called wisdom literature, like books like the Psalms and Proverbs, which makes sense, given that we're comparing them to philosophic wisdom literature of the Greeks. Now, to the differences. Let's see. I'm going to just pull myself up here. Been making you guys look at me in a tiny box this whole time. Okay, now to the differences. Conspicuously absent among the Greek code is any explicit prohibition against violence. Did you notice that? Like, no, thou shalt not kill to be found anywhere. Now, this is an interesting distinction because it implies that physical violence was not only acceptable among the Greeks, it was carved out, so to speak, from the moral code. They're just silent on it. The Greek position is that violence is necessary for survival, and so learning such skills are not only necessary, but they constitute actual virtue. It is necessary to be capable and dangerous. To be otherwise it's not strength, right? It's harmlessness, weakness. Where the Old Testament perspective emphasizes the sin aspect of violence and murder, the responsibility we have to respect life as sacred, you might say. The Greek perspective is different. I mean, they recognize the inevitability of violence and require the virtuous man to be capable of the most brutal behavior in service of safety, persuasion, and peace. And this point tees up the next major difference in the spirit of these codes, which I've summarized as honor of self versus honor of God. And this points, I think, directly to contrasting goals. The laws of Moses are designed to foster holiness and social cohesion, whereas the golden verses are designed to foster self-building, nurturing personal virtue, and becoming ever more perfect in the process. The Old Testament sees the relationship between God and man as one of dependence, subservience, and submission. Man must humble himself to his Creator and rely on his Creator's mercy for their salvation. The Greeks, on the other hand, see it as their personal duty to perfect themselves. This is the path of salvation. The Greeks seem to separate themselves less from the divine as some kind of transcendent, impersonal externality. They see themselves as divine, as participating in the divine in a way the Hebrews did not. This whole dynamic is illustrated in the following contrast. The golden verses compel mankind to be brave in the face of the world, just as the Old Testament does. But listen for how they diverge. Pythagoras says, "Do not fear, for the mortals are divine by race." in the Old Testament, by contrast, says, "Do not fear, for I am with you." And we hear that in Genesis and in Isaiah. Do you see? Do you pick up on it? The Hebrew code describes a world where man is an unworthy and empty vessel whose value comes from outside of him, from God. The world description from the Greeks, however, makes man divine from the start, worthy from the start, and filled with unlimited potential to be harvested. There is a level of agency attributed to mankind by the Greeks that simply is not acknowledged in the Hebrew Bible. In one view, salvation is mercy from God. In the other, it's a result of our individual effort to realize our divine nature. One path is empowering. The other is threatening. One path sees us as formidable by nature. The other as wicked by nature. I do not mean to tip the scales or presume one path to be better in every way. I merely want to demonstrate that other paths existed and are different. They assume different things about the nature of the cosmos. They presume different goals and different virtues. They represent alternative ways of understanding yourself and your place in the world. They give us differing ideals and set different limits on what can be or should be done. And after looking at these side by side, which path would you choose?
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.